talking to Ron this morning on the phone. He made an amazing statement that I was like just blown away, and I don't think I've met anybody else who's done this. Ron has negotiated over $8 billion of contracts, both from the consumer or from the contract manufacturing side, as well as from the
OEM product side.
Yeah,
The product
the
company
OEM
side.
product side. So, I mean, that is just like a staggering number that I think is amazing. So, could you tell us a little bit about kind of what you think about from those decades of experience sitting on one side versus the other?
It's a very different experience on each side. I started out on the OEM side in the fairly early days of outsourcing. It was back at a time when most people had their own factories, and most people said, look, manufacturing is our strategic advantage, and that's not really something you've heard a product company say in a very long time. And so the negotiations tended to be, fairly tactical. Having them build our product or part of our product was one part of what we did. But we were a big, OEM. There was a sales, there was a marketing. I used to say that the hierarchy at an OEM was kind of, marketing, sales, R&D, janitorial, manufacturing. And so it was a very tactical thing. But then when you step into the contract manufacturing world, it is just so different. Most OEMs in the U.S. will run, 38 to low 40s, on the gross margin. Some, if you're Cisco, in the 60s. If you're Apple, somewhere above 100, I'm not sure. In the contract manufacturing world, the global average last year was just under 3%. And we used to say in contract manufacturing that the difference between world-class and bankruptcy is 2 points. And so you put a lot more thought into every single aspect of that contract. What might cost you, what does cost you, where might you find a half a point extra if you make the language sloppy, and then you can kind of sneak things up. So I spent about 10 years on that side, and then I founded the Supply Chain Resource Group. And so now I've spent the last 8 or 9 years back on the other side. And it arms you well for what the other guys are thinking, where they're going to try and pick around the edges. So it's pretty interesting.
That's great.
It'd be more interesting if we'd done this after they'd start serving alcohol here.
Could you talk a little bit about what inspired you to kind of leave Flextronics and go out and start your own consulting firm?
So there were a couple of big secular trends in the world at the time. One was globalization. The world was just getting flatter and flatter. And outsourcing had hit a tipping point in, maybe around 2005, where it had, at least in electronics, it had shifted to become the predominant model. So around 2005, more than 50% of the world's electronics became manufactured by somebody other than brand-owning enterprise. And you would think that those two trends would favor all companies equally. But being at one of the larger contract manufacturers, it was very clear that the people with the resources globally could really advantage and gain the system. And it didn't actually level the playing field. It actually made it harder for startups. It made it harder for small companies. At Cisco or at Apple, I interviewed a guy from Apple the other day who was literally the senior GSM for metric balance groups, right? And I had a meeting with a customer of ours the other day, and I was meeting with the senior vice president of operations, facilities, corporate administration, and manufacturing. All right, here's one person wearing 4 hats, and then here's somebody who has a team of people that focuses on screws. And it's very hard to offset that in finding suppliers and contracting with suppliers. So we thought, let's go get a bunch of operations people around the world and make them available to these smaller companies so that you don't have to have all of this yourself, right? You can have a fractionalized supplier quality engineer here, or you can bring in one of our people that's done contracts to help you there. And that's kind of how we got started. 2008, not the best time, but it's worked out. We're about 160 people in 5 countries now.
That's huge.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay, let's get to the meat of this conversation, which is, can you tell me a little bit about the most valuable terms that you think drive alignment between a contract manufacturer and an OEM to continuous improvement operationally?
I can, but if I may, before I go there, in order to get to those terms, and what really is important it's important that people negotiating the contract have some understanding of both the product, the process, and what's going to happen or what is happening in the factory. And I see a lot of startups and even very large companies, they will have people that are contract specialists, but don't know manufacturing. And this isn't a real estate contract, this isn't a will. And so I would encourage everyone to make sure that at your company, there's some voice of operation. One of the things I like to say, because I've been asked this question before, is I've never seen a lawyer in a factory. And so no matter how good of a lawyer you are, you don't know what you don't know. I mean, some of the terms are even different. In terms of what terms are really important, I think a lot of companies have become fairly adversarial with their contract manufacturing base. I think I mentioned to you this morning, probably 30% of the incoming calls we get as a company starts with, hello, I hear you guys know something about contract manufacturing. My contract manufacturer sucks. Okay, can you find me a new one? Yeah, I can, but should I? And about half the time we don't. About half the time we go, look, let's figure out what isn't working. And a lot of the time it's, I've looked in the mirror and it's me, right? It's me as the OEM giving them bad data, not understanding their constraints, asking them to do things that aren't possible, and then being upset when they don't. So creating a system that's balanced, getting the best deal you can, but making sure that you don't drive your supplier to an untenable economic proposition. And I have found that, we're actually able to drop costs the fastest when we put incentives into the contract. Those incentives sometimes are cost reduction sharing. Look, if you bring an idea and we adopt it, you get to keep it for 6 months. Or, you get to keep half of it, something like that. Or we did a contract one time that was very effective where we actually had an end-of-year bonus based on certain performance metrics. So, look, if you do pretty well, you're going to make your 3 points. But if you hit all of these by the end of the year, I'm going to give you what is the equivalent of an extra 1.5 points of margin, which, for our client at the time, which was, probably 55% margin, 1.5 points was probably the best money they ever spent in terms of what they got back. So, try and create a win-win situation and don't just squeeze every last penny out of them because they'll cut the corners that you don't want cut.
Cool. Okay, when we get to those terms.
So,
Pieces?
So first off, pricing in anything goes down over time, or almost anything. Certainly the price of technology for equivalent functionality definitely goes down, right? The cost of memory is dropping. And so one of the things we see a lot of the big guys kind of, I wouldn't say try and sneak through, but they'll look at, okay, here are the terms of the contract. This is a 1-year contract, it's a 3-year contract. And then somewhere, in some big paragraph, they'll try and slip in something like, the price shall remain fixed. But what? So nothing will get better over a year. The cost of material's not going to go down. There's no learning curve. There's no yield improvement. Well, of course there is. But their goal is to try and set up something where they can keep that. And so you want them to keep some of that. You want them to be incentivized to do these things, but you don't want to give it all away because, you're going to be under margin pressure too. So that's one of them. There are some other ones. I like this one too. The supplier reserves the right to update the price. Makes me want to be a supplier. So equitable adjustments. You usually see these more in companies from Singapore or Taiwan. All the European guys have this. Not so much the pure Chinese play contract manufacturers, but equitable adjustments will be on page 15. And it's back in the legal stuff where if you're looking at the contract, all the ops people will go, oh, my job's done, this is all just legal stuff. But it's basically this clause that says, look, if something kind of changed and it's unexpected, we kind of have the right to just go back and up your price. And they usually don't do it in some egregious way. Oh, I'm going to double my price, I'm going to give you a 10% price increase. But keep in mind, they're operating on a 3% margin structure, so getting half a point, getting a point is very, very big for them. So they put this stuff in there, and then once you've launched your product, once you're fully in bed together, then they'll go, hey, it's going to be really high switching cost. It's such a pain to switch factories. I'm going to go and say, I need some equitable relief because of A, B, or C. It's not a bad concept, but you need to know it's in there. You need to define it, have means of measuring it, have agreed upon remedies for it. as opposed to just some kind of loose, open-ended thing that says beyond the supplier's reasonable control. Oh, my yields are 10 points less. Okay, continue on. What's the rest of that conversation? Is that because of the process, because of the design? Why are they 10 points less? So equitable relief is one of the kind of sneaky terms that, if you get a contract that's bigger than 3 pages, don't read it from front to back, read it from back to front. And, they'll tell you what that equitable relief is, what's causing it, if you ask them. Otherwise, they'll just say, you get what you want. I like this one. This is going to be a test, so everybody try and memorize this. This is the I am going to baffle you with legal bullshit approach, right? I've got a pricing term here, and it's a paragraph long. And the only reason it's a paragraph long is because I cut it out so it would fit on one slide. And you go, and you start reading it, and you go, okay, that's probably fine. So let's go, what does this really mean? So if you dig into this, yada yada, I just inserted that, by the way. And this one is fairly egregious, and almost everybody does this. If it's a new product or if it's transfer from a different company, they'll say, look, I'll build it, I'll do the whole thing, FAT out the door, or $110. And then once you get going, they'll say, when I said $110, I assumed that end-to-end yield would be 106%, and it's actually not. And so we have to go adjust that. Well, where did you make this assumption? Well, we made this in our calculations. Well, did you share those calculations? Did we document those assumptions? Do they exist anywhere in the contract that you based your price on a number that's now changed? And even though sometimes in these they say that they will, they say, well, we'll put these assumptions. They never do. They never do. And so how do you argue with them? Well, are you sure that's the assumption you used? It's a no-win situation because you can't prove the negative. And so when there is something like this, you've got to go define it. And if you go get a quote, I know you got to get launched next week. But you've got to go write down everything that went into that assumption. How did you arrive at this? And then most importantly, and I'm kind of hogging the whole thing.
That's okay. I got a few thoughts on this. I think as we're talking through these contracts, I think you're highlighting the fact that they're actually, every piece in the contract is quite negotiable. And getting a contract and sending it to your legal counsel, that's okay. Your legal counsel is also working on all HR issues, the lease that you're signing, right? Like, they're not an expert in this. Like, you should make yourself an expert in it and dive in and understand the terms. So I mean, that for me, as we're talking through this, I think is an underlying message. Like, be creative, get in there, say what you want and negotiate. And I think that is a huge advantage. One piece that I'd love to get your thought on is, a lot of people go for negotiating right for cost, right? Like they think oh, I'm going to negotiate the cost right off the bat. I know some have strategies to actually not dive in and negotiate the cost because CMs are often groomed that they know the cost is going to get negotiated every quarter from now until eternity. But there are other things that they won't bring back up that you won't be able to get into the contract. Do you have a strategy on that? Do you dive into costs or do you look at other terms? Right, we're talking about.
Yeah, so when we first are looking for a supplier for somebody, most people go, let's go do an RFQ. Let's go get quotes. And I go, no, let's do an RFQ. Let's tell them what we're looking for. Let's tell them what drives our business. Let's tell them what the fundamental capabilities and concerns we have are. And let's understand who fits that. And so we push pricing back, kind of late in the process. Now, having said that, we'll always move forward with, kind of the best 2 companies. Because sometimes you just can't get a contract done, whether it's pricing, whether it's terms. Lately indemnification has become a real sticking point. Who's indemnifying who? If your Tesla blows up and, they subcontracted the battery guy is a Tesla guy is the assembly house. And so we tend to push the pricing conversation relatively late. And one of the things that allows us to push it relatively late is you need transparency, and the contract needs to specify that there is transparency. Now, if you agree that your supplier's going to give you transparency, and here are my basic cost buckets.
This is super important.
Yeah.
The most important part.
This is the most important part. So if you get transparency, and you get real transparency, you can't use that as a hammer and say, you're making 3.5 points and I want you to make 3. That's not what transparency is for. It's if you can't drive down the cost. When your boss comes in and says, you know, look, I need the cost to go down by 6%, you know, this quarter. You can't drive down the cost unless you know where they are, right? You need to know what buckets. How much of it's material? How much of it's markup? How much of it's labor? How much of it's overhead? How much of it's yield loss? And so go define, I need transparency. Here is the buckets I need the transparency in, but also have a clause on how that transparency will and will not be used, right? You can't use it as a hammer all the time. But if you build a relationship with the supplier and say, let's go work on these issues together, and you have to let them know that there's something in it for you. When I worked for a big contract manufacturer, whenever I go into a contract negotiation and have my program managers there, I'd go, keep in mind, you know, we have a 5% margin. So every time I save them $1, it costs me a nickel. So don't save them $1, right? Because it's not exactly a cost plus, but it's kind of structured that way. So the holy grail here is get transparency, define what transparency is, and continue to manage that transparency, because the more you know about the product cost, the better equipped you are to go drive them down.
And then we touched on it a little bit at the beginning, but the shared cost savings. Is that one of those things at the very beginning that you put in? And this is like if they make improvements in efficiency or cost down with their other suppliers, or?
We try to establish right at the beginning that, you know, we are not looking necessarily for the absolute lowest cost, but we are looking for the best possible total value. And not the best total value in quarter one. Because if you drive them to, you know, if you've taken every fraction of a penny out of it, they will learn that next quarter, you know, oh, the cost of my stencils tripled, and I've got to charge you a carrying cost for this. And so I've seen people drive their cost up by negotiating hard. I don't know if there's any HP people in the room, but HP used to be just famous for that. You know, they'd think they were getting the absolute best deal because they just come in like a hammer, and you just nickel and dime them around the back door because you know what they were picking on and they didn't know the game. And whereas you get smaller companies say, look, I don't know what I'm doing, I just want to be a good partner. And they'd end up getting a much better price overall. So it's not intuitive, but look, it's a partnership and you can't do anything without your CM. I mean, how many people in the audience have their own factory? Yeah, it's a non-zero number. I'm a little bit speechless. The rest of you, you know, look, you are really beholden to those people, and they need to be successful too.
Cool. Okay, my last question. Not many people, when they're in kindergarten, think like, I want to work at a factory. I want to, you know, put on those overalls and I want to.
Unless you live in Laos.
I want to fly to China every month and work at a factory. Most people, you know, want to be doctors or vets or policemen, whatever it may be. Tell me a little bit about how you decided that you wanted to, you know, go into operations.
You know, from the time I was a little kid, my dad had this really cool workshop, awesome tools, just like Sikoldie's dad, and I loved taking stuff apart, electronic stuff. You know, that was back when, you know, your TV had tubes and stuff. I'm like, what the hell do these things do? And I remember from the time I was this big, you know, you take the back panel off, you look in there and go, what the hell are all these things? How can anybody possibly understand how you throw a bunch of stuff in this big box and I can watch Gilligan's Island? And I was just fascinated by it, and it just never stopped, and it still never stopped. I probably do 70, 80 factory tours, you know, a year, and everything from, you know, server boards to cookies to cigarettes to, and it just, I always learn something. I always see, oh, that's how that goes together. You know, I have a 10-year-old at home. We'll sit there and binge watch how it's made. You know, so I guess I missed a gene somewhere.
Cool. Okay. Well, that's the wrap up of the questions. Thank you, Ron. I could open it up to the audience for a few questions. Okay, great.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is, I work for two large corporations, and I told our lawyers we didn't want to have more than like 3 to 5 page contract. They laughed at me. 90% of what's in those contracts is legalese, and I couldn't get around it. Just what are your comments about price and cost? You're going to hear from me later on talk about that. And I actually had a quote one I work for a rooster league. I had a quote one of
Yeah, I think that's a good quote. I mean, you want to cut out the fat. You don't want to cut out the muscle because, you need the machine to work and the muscle's pretty important to that. And it's interesting. I swear, I mean, I could, we go have a beer and I can tell you a bunch of examples, but I can almost statistically prove that the guys that pound it the hardest get a less economically optimized deal in the end than the people that are more participative and collaborative.
I have the same feelings.
What do you think is more important, the contract or the relationship and the communication?
It's definitely the relationship and the communication. After we do the contract, we tend to do this one-page thing that we call the rules of engagement. How are we going to work together? Who's going to do what? How often are we going to do it? If that blows up, what is the escalation path? And when do you escalate? We see a lot of people that haven't done this a lot, and there'll be one little blip in the factory, and they're sending a flamogram to the CEO of some $300 million CM who doesn't know anything about what's going on, right? You got to pick your battles. And so one of the things we like to say, once we start working on these, the rules of engagement, we say, when, this is a great contract, thank you very much, we put it in the drawer. When that contract comes back out of the drawer to look at it again, there's usually something wrong with the relationship. So having said that, you got to get the right contract because, management change, things change, but put it in the drawer, agree how you're going to work on things, and go at it as a partnership. Thank you all very much.